I'd like to welcome you all to this edition of our Policy Research Talk series. As you know, these talks are a way of us to show what we are doing in the research group to everybody in the bank and to everybody outside the bank. And today we are fortunate to have with us Michael Woolcock on a topic that is both familiar and provocative: development as creative destruction. You know of this phrase in the context of Joseph Schumpeter and the capitalist development, but it has also been a core concept in the development debate for a very long time. In 1951, a United Nations report argued that, and this is interesting rhetoric for a United Nations report, rapid economic progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped. Old social institutions have to disintegrate. Bonds of caste, creed, and race have to burst. And large numbers of people who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. So, bottom line, there is no progress without pain. And in development, creative destruction is not simply a story of innovation replacing obsolescence. It's also a story about people, communities, institutions being compelled to move from one social order into another, often with little agreement on what should be preserved, what should be changed, and who has the authority to decide. So, Michael, you will help us today to think about creative destruction, not as just a mechanism for growth, but as a lived and contested process. What appears from one perspective as modernization, reform, or progress may be experienced from another as disorientation, exclusion, or loss. And the central question then is, how can development be pursued in ways that are both credible and legitimate to those who bear the costs of adjustment? I must say this reminded me of a book I read a long time ago called The Pyramids of Sacrifice. It also reminds me of the bank restructurings that we go through at regular intervals. But let me tell you a little bit about Michael. You know, he joined the Development Research Group in 1998, and his title is not lead economist, but lead social scientist. He was the first non-economist to be recruited by Aghion, and in his nearly 3 decades of services, he has made exceptional contributions to our understanding of the sociological underpinnings of development. Some of the topics he has covered in his distinguished career are strategies for enhancing state capability for implementation, how to create more effective interaction between informal and formal justice systems, and how we can use mixed methods to better understand the effectiveness of complex development interventions. I say this because Michael is soon going to move on, and will leave a big gap that economists with their limitations will struggle to fulfill. Our discussant is Susana Cordero Guerra, the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. She manages the bank's engagement with 31 countries. She just told me that this job is brutal but wonderful. And she oversees a portfolio of more than $40 billion. She has held senior leadership positions at the Inter-American Development Bank and the government of Brazil, and she received her PhD in political science from MIT, and she could also have been a lead social scientist in the research group if she chose to be. Michael, you'll speak for 45 minutes, Susanna for 10 minutes. We will open the floor for questions then. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in WebEx or signal your question in the chat, and I will call on you during the questions and answers. The session is being recorded, so please ensure your microphone is muted when not speaking. Michael.
Okay, are we going to bring up the slides? Anyway, we'll get started. Thanks so much, Aditya, for that welcome to me, and thanks to all of you for being here with us. I'm honored to be given this opportunity to speak most formally, I guess, for the final time as an employee of the World Bank. I gave the second of the policy research talks that was launched back in 2013. Jishnu Das gave the first one. I did the second one. And this is my third one and final one. So I guess I'm trying to use it as an opportunity for us to have a big picture conversation. Indermit Gill, our chief economist, has lamented the fact that Descartes doesn't seem to engage much in big picture stuff. So I thought, here we are, I'm at the end of the line, I can get away with what I'm going to say. I'm going to try and articulate and help us engage with this very vexed issue that we somewhat crudely call creative destruction, but which I think if we can tame it a little bit, if we can put some parameters around it and put it in some categories to help us think about it, it will enable us to engage with this very difficult issue in a more constructive way. And that's what I wanted it to be. I want it to be a creative discussion, even if that in itself might require some minor destruction along the way. In one sense, the intuitive understanding of creative destruction is something we're all very familiar with. Some obvious examples of creative destruction in action include going from a horse and buggy to now we have self-driving cars, gramophones and vinyl records being replaced by online streaming services, Kodak film giving way to innumerable selfies being taken for free on our iPhones, candles and coal to solar power and wind farms, carrier pigeons to iPhones. So all of these things are intuitively make sense. There was a creation, and it led to the demise of what had gone before it. But I think if we push it forward a bit further, we can recognize that there haven't always been happy stories to tell. We have a very happy story when we turn washboards into washing machines. That's declared one of the great empowering inventions of human history, as was the invention of sewage systems. That was the invention of the simple toilet, or the toilet we now take for granted, was deemed by public health experts a few years ago to be the most consequential invention of humans over the last 200 years. So when we talk about it like that, everybody can get on board. Everybody thinks we're having a good time saving the world from itself. And I want to try and push that a little bit more and try and recognize that these things don't always go that way. It can be a truly vastly and welfare-enhancing exercise, but it can also be a way for great grief, great suffering, and great dislocation and disorientation, or what the great sociologist Emil Durkheim called anomie, feeling disassociated from the world in ways that have required you to leave one world but yet not enter another. And we'll come back to some of those things. I will argue today that the fullness of the journey from low to high income status, which this organization explicitly tries to help its client countries achieve, even when it's actually attained, is more akin to what Albert Hirschman called an epic adventure. That's the right metaphor, I think. My students at the Kennedy School know that's exactly how I open my class and close it, that development is epic. So it's an adventure because it's often intense, dramatic, and life-changing. And it's epic because it's risky, sometimes yielding triumph, sometimes failure and disillusion, and other times decades of violent disaster. It requires us to acknowledge that development by design and by definition changes everything, sometimes in a way we don't see or understand, sometimes in a way that a standard benefit-cost analysis can't capture, in ways our traditional data and metrics don't comprehend or apprehend. To celebrate only the creation side is to be incomplete. And I'll come back and use that word several times over the next 40 minutes or so. Incompleteness has always been my concern, whether it's in the research department or in how we, in our operational lives, try to do things. For me, as a sociologist, it so often feels incomplete. And we'll come back to that later on. To celebrate only that creation side is one example of what it means to be incomplete. We'll explore more complex, contentious, and everyday examples of creative destruction shortly. But I want to begin by telling you a few things about how creative destruction has shaped my own life, or more specifically and consequentially, the lives of my ancestors across the 19th century. I'm a product of creative destruction, as almost surely you are, in some degree or other. My rather strange and somewhat unique surname, Woolcock, is Cornish in origin. My mother's lineage is from Scotland, but I'm a fourth-generation Australian. Why and how did that happen? Let me tell you. Because on my father's side, I'm the descendant of Cornish tin miners, whose skills were deemed redundant in the 1870s because the mines were empty and their skills were no longer needed. So they accepted an offer of a one-way ticket for 3 months on a crowded, precarious boat that would take them to literally the opposite ends of the earth, some 15,000 miles away, to re-establish themselves in utterly alien conditions at gold mines, first in southern Victoria and later in northern Queensland, never to return. On my mother's side, I'm a descendant of a founding employee, the first agricultural advisor, of the Van Diemen's Land Company, a firm created by the British government in the 1820s for the explicit purpose of doing three things in what is now known as Tasmania. We'll come back to this. In Tasmania, which you surely know is the small little island at the southern tip of Australia. Its three tasks that it set itself were: one, building and operating a maximum security prison for convicts; two, identifying ways to find and improve arable land for settlers, to improve, to use that word explicitly, improve, which was essentially what we would now refer to as development, but that was the main word in the 19th century. And thirdly, explicitly, eradicating every single one of the 6,000 Aboriginal people that lived on Van Diemen's Land at the time. A people with a heritage spanning at least 40,000 years on that island. Van Diemen's Land Company succeeded on all three fronts. They met their KPIs, if you will. They had their dashboard all telling them what they wanted to hear, especially the third one. Within 25 years, almost every single one of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people had been slaughtered. I only learnt this relatively recently when I was doing a lineage of my own family heritage and trying to see how that was consistent with or going to influence the way that my children came to see themselves. But it taught me a lot about how I began to see myself. If you're a Midnight Oil fan, perhaps you know the song Truganini. That's all about this particular phenomena. Great song, you should listen to it, I hope. So one might say I have creative destruction baked into me, as do most of us here today, I think, if you were to have access to the records that would enable you to learn where you had actually come from 10 generations back, 20 generations back. How do I know all these details about myself? Because the British colonialists, for all their daring do and genocide, meticulously collected and curated data. So that's how it was used and can still always be used. For my ancestors in Australia in the early 19th century, or from that particular starting point, we now fast forward to the early 21st century in Vanuatu, where I and my mission team find ourselves in a somber meeting with 30 village elders. This happened about a decade or so ago. The team that I was working with was trying to engage with an applied research project on understanding transitions in customary justice systems into what we more broadly call rule of law initiatives. And we had this wonderful meeting all set up for us with a team of about 30 village elders, all of them men. And we were sitting around, and then the chief of that particular group stood up and addressed me personally. He said, "Michael, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining our meeting here today. We're here to discuss the state of schooling, and I just want you to know that I'm really proud that my daughter is about to graduate from high school. She'll be the first in our family line to ever have graduated. So we're really proud of her for doing that. But there's a bigger story you need to know. The first is that unfortunately my daughter looks at all 30 people on this committee and knows that we're illiterate and thus thinks we're fools. She doesn't take us seriously anymore. She doesn't really care what we say because we're foolish as far as she is concerned. She doesn't like the fact that it's all men that are on this particular committee. She's been told that she needs to assert herself more strongly and not just bow to what she thinks we're telling her. She starts using a very different language to talk about her life. She now talks about having a career. I didn't even know what that word was when I first heard it. Now she's talking about a career, fulfilling herself, making the most of her potential. We never speak to each other that way. And I worry that in order for her to do that, she's actually going to have to lead this particular village where we all live right now. And if she leaves, that means she's probably going to marry a boy in the capital city. And if she marries a boy in the capital city, then she'll stay there, and we'll have lost her. And she won't be able to teach her kids how to speak our language because they won't grow up in it. And we may now watch ourselves start to decline, potentially even fall apart. So I just want to tell you that we're really grateful for the education systems the World Bank has been providing for us. I just want you to know that it's completely destroying our community. Thank you for coming. That little episode from that village elder pretty much summarizes what I'm going to try and talk about today. The ways in which, even when we succeed in development, we are putting in motion potentially very challenging, corrosive ways of engaging that have prevailed sometimes for thousands or tens of thousands of years in the lives of people that we are working with or on whose behalf we claim to be working. These are really, really difficult issues to engage with, and I've deliberately chosen the language of creative destruction to engage with that because I think the way in which it is addressed in the current literature doesn't go this way. It largely focuses on just relatively particular forms of employment that are rendered redundant. We can produce nice graphs showing that the redundancy of skills pretty much approximate the creation of jobs, so we really shouldn't have to worry too much about this. And that's true, potentially, if you live in a country that's able to provide you with employment and insurance, with healthcare, and with free training opportunities to do that. But that's precisely what we don't have in most developing countries. So the safety net, as it were, that we might have for thinking about these issues just isn't present in most of those particular places. In scholarly terms, the idea of creative discussion is most popularly associated with Joseph Schumpeter, as Aditya said, but he's more sort of a popularizer rather than a particular theorist around this particular issue. Indeed, when you look at the intellectual history of these kind of concepts of the origins of worrying about how things are going to change, we can even go back to poetry by the great Rabindranath Tagore, himself articulating ideas from Hindu theology, which was, as it concludes in that statement there, our bodies grow weary of its law-fixed path. Give us new forms, seeing our destruction, that we can gain new life. So this has been around a long time. It was able to spread and gain greater traction once it had been articulated in more formal academic circles and then was able to be turned into the beginnings of what we now call endogenous growth theory. Other people have talked about this as well. But the fact that there's still a lot of contention and debate about it, I want us to see, in some sense, as a virtue, not a vice, as something that we should welcome rather than try to desperately to refine. There's a wonderful idea from a philosopher called W.B. Garley who talks about these kinds of ideas and as a category that he calls essentially contested concepts. I love that term, right? Essentially contested. It means they don't have a clear definition. They don't have clear metrics that they map onto. They don't map into a coherent theory necessarily, but they do all their work by helping us have the kind of conversations we're having today. The fact that we don't agree about things is itself a virtue. It requires us to defend whatever particular stance we have. And I think that's true of a lot of the terms that we use in social science. Actually, they're in this category of essentially contested. They might have a dictionary definition of sorts, but they don't necessarily enable the bigger conversations to happen. And I think that's true with what we're dealing with when we're engaging with these big questions that center on what we are calling creative destruction. So I think it's a feature, not a bug, that's in this particular category. So on the one hand, both Marx and Schumpeter worried that creative destruction was unstable, that this was corrosive, that it was going to undermine the very foundations of the way that capitalist growth was unfolding, and eventually it would sort of implode upon itself. Now, there are different ideological and theoretical reasons for why that collapse would take place, this is not the place to deal with that. It's just important to know that even from the beginning, this was not mapped or aligned with one particular ideological or theoretical stance. It had multiple people weighing in on it. When Philippe, Aghion, and Peter Howitt last year won the Nobel Prize for that, much of their work there was about providing a vastly more optimistic view of what creative destruction could do. It wasn't going to implode, it wasn't going to bring the house down. In fact, it was going to keep the house thriving if we did it the right way. And I mentioned just before, what are some of the corresponding policy initiatives that have to work in the same space as creative destruction in order for it not to do its destructing. But for present purposes, I'm not going to, it's not my place to weigh in on endogenous growth theory, that's not my thing. But I will take a guide from Robert Heilbronner, one of the authors of the book many of you perhaps read as undergraduates, The Worldly Philosophers, The Lives, Times, and Ideas of the Great Economic Thinkers. And in that particular volume, he says, he presents us with an apparent contradiction. Capitalism may be an economic success, but it is not a sociological success, he says. This is because the economic base of capitalism creates its ideological superstructure. Rational rather than romantic, critical rather than heroic, designed for men in lounge suits, designed for men in lounge suits, not armor. I love that sentence. For Schumpeter, in the end, it is this capitalist frame of mind, this capitalist mentality that brings down the house, that brings down the system. I don't want to go there either. I want us to we have, as World Bank staff, a mandate, and as World Bank as development professionals listening to this from wherever you are in the world, we have a mandate to try and improve the lives of people in the ways that our instruments allow. But the fullness or the more complete understanding of what it means to engage in that process requires us to acknowledge that even when we are succeeding in this space, let alone failing, we are putting in motion these very fundamental changes in the way that people engage with each other in the relational space. And I think that matters because how we get along with each other is fundamentally, and has always been, humanity's greatest challenge. Everything that from biblical, theological, philosophical writings over thousands of years has all come back to how do we actually get along with each other when we have all these differences? How do we find commonalities when there are so many differences? And development can indeed bring people together. Everyone in this room, I imagine, comes from probably 60 or 70 different countries in the world. They probably speak that many languages if we were to go around and count them all. We figured out how to get along because we can, because we have to, because we want to. But that's not always how things are. And trying to figure out how to create a development space that is not weaponized by our differences, but actually sees them as assets, has always been, as I said, will continue to be the biggest challenge that we face. I also just want to mention briefly that we need to have a bit of clarity even around a word that perhaps we didn't think we needed to have clarity around, development itself. Because I think over the last few decades or so, what that definition once was widely understood to mean now has morphed into different directions and is understood actually quite differently by different stakeholders and different recipients or providers of this thing we call development. I'm going to stress, because not only because of who I work for, but what I focus on and what this particular work is interested in, is this idea of national development, that we're really trying to engage with countries and help them to fulfill the goals and the targets that they themselves have set. And that matters because I think when we're engaging with these questions of creative destruction, they are nonetheless manifest most powerfully and intensely at a very community and individual level. So they have these macro consequences for how societies work together, but the mechanisms that we experience and the mechanisms perhaps over which we have some control are more in this sort of in the middle or the lower, the micro spaces. So my goal today is to forge a path between in some sense, the catastrophizers and the apologists. That is to say, the people who think that creative destruction is benign and it's the key way in which we think about how economic progress is going to occur, and those that regard this whole machinery as literally a machine, and that machine is destined to tear us all apart and to ultimately potentially blow the world up. There has to be, and there must be, and there can be a path that helps us to reconcile those different critiques and to move it forward. I'm going to move us forward into this particular. I have to. This is a very smart group of Colombian prisoners who figured out how to do this transition from carrier pigeon to iPhone in one fell swoop, and figured out how to get a bird carrying an iPhone on the back of itself into their jail until they were discovered. But it just appealed to me as a wonderful way in which you can work at both ends of the spectrum and find some commonality between the two. I'll also just quickly look at this map of what Van Diemen's Land looked like in 1828, which is exactly when my great-great-great-grandfather showed up to do his thing with the Van Diemen's Land Company. But this is also from the museum in Hobart, and I'm always interested in museums around the world that tell the kind of story that if I was a consultant, I would want them to tell. And this is what I saw when I was looking at this particular museum, discussing the ways in which the British Van Diemen's Land Company had functioned. While ships and guns were the colonists' major tools, they were not the only thing the British brought with them. They came to Van Diemen's Land with a particular way of seeing the world. Europe had just passed through the Enlightenment, a period when our modern scientific understanding emerged. They had come increasingly to live in a world of numbers, a world where places in the landscape, the time of day, the weight and the value of things could all be mathematically described. Just as important was the idea of improvement. Landowners earned their right to property by improving it. It was an individual's duty to improve themselves, materially, morally, and mentally, through commerce, science, and discipline. Read Paul Slack's The Invention of Improvement, if you want a good summer read. Some people ask me for that from time to time. Write that down. It's a great book about where this idea even of improvement came and how improvement morphed over time subsequently into what we now call development. But I liked those particular ways of moving forward with things. I won't do those. What I do want to do now, though, is to try and turn this idea of creative destruction into 4 different categories and focus on one particular one, since we don't have time to go into all of the others. I'm also going to preview that I'm not going to have much to say about what role AI will have as an agent of creative destruction. We have a WDR being written on this. We have endless groups worrying and doing really excellent work trying to figure this all out. So I don't want to steal their thunder or pretend that I have something deep and meaningful to say about it at this particular point. I do, though. I'm working on a paper this summer on what AI can't do. And I think that any sort of attempts to try and do anything in life should be also looked at, not just what I'm wanting to do, but what am I not going to do as at least one first step in figuring out what we might move forward with it. So the first type of creative destruction is actually destructive creation, with a capital D and a capital C, an ideology manifest as policy. And I just didn't only learn this yesterday, but the common expression, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, which we all understand, that was first articulated in the early 1810s as the French Revolution was being articulated, and that's what the justification for it was. The justification was we have to destroy everything in order to be able to create something new. So that's one particular version of what we might call creative destruction. I'm calling it destructive creation, and seeing it more as an ideology, manifest as policy, often in very, very dangerous ways. That was explicitly what I would call what the Van Diemen's Land Company was doing. It was doing a lot of destructive creation. And the quote that Aditya read before from the UN from 1951 was an explicit case of that. Modernization theory at its peak in the 1950s argued explicitly that that's what our particular task was. Let's read it again because it bears a lot of repeating. Rapid economic progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped, old social institutions have to disintegrate, bonds of caste, creed, and race have to burst, and large numbers of people who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. Very few communities are willing to pay the full price of economic progress. Fortunately, Thank God. That is not how we speak to each other. But the legacy of that kind of still lives on in some ways, right? And I think it's important for us to know as a profession, this is how we once talked to each other. It was okay to talk that way. And that was very much to me an instance of destructive creation. Then we can have creative destruction with a capital C and a capital D. And here a different sort of slogan defines that, the move quickly, break things, from Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook. And in 2016, that was the explicit creed talked about and championed. Perhaps great marketing just because we're still talking about it 10 years later and that's as far as we should take it seriously. But nonetheless, I think certain groups of people did, in fact, take it very seriously. Rather than looking at particular sources of empirical evidence per se, if you are not an American and you didn't read The Grapes of Wrath growing up, read it this summer too. My daughter recommended that book to me and said, Dad, I think this is the best development book you'll probably ever read. And it is, if you see it from a creative destruction sort of role, about how brutal the transitions out of agriculture were for people in the 1930s in the midst of a Great Depression, in the midst of all the dust bowls that were completely eradicating the fertility of the land, and with no support structures other than themselves having to figure out how to do with that. So that's creative destruction, but something that's manifest as policy, pretty aggressive and assertive, and kind of believing that that's how you really achieve big things in life. I hope you don't run your household like that. If you're a manager, I hope you don't treat your staff like that. And if we're doing work in operational work with our client governments, I hope we don't treat each other like that either. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, just saying those are very real modalities in explicit ways in which this idea of creative destruction is sometimes articulated. Perhaps it's best to deal with that, though, through a cartoon. We like to move fast and break things. Great, I like things done quickly too. Wait, we don't get anything done. We just move fast and break things. That's kind of my somewhat satirical critique of all of that. If that's all you're doing, then you're not actually creating anything. You're just essentially reversing back to the destructive creation place. The more interesting stuff, I think, is deconstructive creation, which is, I think, is an inherent part of what anybody does in their own life, actually. But I'm just going to call it legitimate dismantling today in the hope of broad improvement tomorrow. It's a wager that you make, right? Going to grad school was that kind of investment. Doing a PhD was even a more weird one. But more pragmatic things like creating the interstate highway systems here in the US, or the Belt and Road Initiative that China's funding, anything to do with slum upgrading programs where you are temporarily claiming that you're just going to move people away for a year or two, build them something better, and then invite them back in. Dams, all of those things require you to do some form of destructing, but as long as it's done in some authorized, legitimate way, we live with that. We say, well, that is actually the price of progress in that particular space. I've got a bit of a highlight there, though, on the social justice campaigns. It's been in that kind of category as well, because when you're trying to end slavery, or when you're trying to end sexism, you're trying to end something. You're trying to literally to deconstruct a particular set of practices, potentially grounded in law, that have been around for a heck of a long time. And if your campaign is set, or your task that you've set yourself is trying to get rid of that, and you're trying to just deconstruct that particular thing, then I think you're in that kind of space. I've got little dots after it, though, because whoever you are up against probably has an equally morally righteous claim they can make about why keeping things are the way they are is just fine. That's how we want it to be. So those particular discussions that we have in the different parts of the bank are different kinds of conversations, but they're ones that have very different kinds of creative destruction components built into them. It's a different kind of modality of engagement. It's a very different kind of task that needs, in some sense, still to be assessed for accountability purposes and our own sense of achieving things. But it also, nonetheless, can be extraordinarily painful and difficult to engage with that. How long did it take to end slavery? 400 years. How long did it take to authorize in the United States interracial marriage? 140 years. Right? Does that mean the previous 139 were all just failures and they didn't know what they were doing and running around and making mistakes everywhere? Or do the really, really hard things like ending slavery, like promoting democracy, gender equality, do they just happen to take a heck of a long time? And you might spend a whole career doing something that doesn't appear to have actually achieved much for you. But you do it anyway because you know or you believe that if you do your bit and the subsequent generations do their bit, one day somehow that particular tide will turn. And you won't get any credit for it, but you don't care because you have a particular belief in that as the modality or the task that you are called to do in this particular life. So we're getting into more interesting and contested spaces here because what we're trying to achieve, who's resisting it, how it counts as success in this particular moment, how you keep justifying your actions to ensure your funding is re-given to you each time. That's a very different kind of space to what this building and the ethos of the World Bank engages with. We want to be able to have nice, clear metrics. We want to be able to show impacts pretty clearly and rigorously, oftentimes just using a particular kind of methodology for just making those kinds of claims. But we need that in certain domains, and it's in a particular set of cases, it's the right way to assess things. But when you're engaging with social stuff, you are in a very different space where the trajectories of impact are likely to be very nonlinear, very non-uniform. And once you're in a non-uniform, non-universal space, as well as I'll conclude, it makes evaluation claims and counterclaims really, really difficult to have. Finally, we have creative destruction as we might want it to be, perhaps. But even here, I'm going to stress, though, that there are two different variants. One is that we'll just call within a prevailing paradigm. When Kodak transit gets ditched and we all start having Apple iPhones, right? That's still science doing what science does. The people who work in that particular space are pretty familiar potentially with the fact that the very essence of science is trying to challenge ideas, is trying to prove them, trying to refine them, trying to enhance them, and when those are put into commercial spaces, eventually sometime what you're doing right now is not going to be relevant anymore. So that's what I'm just going to call intra-paradigmatic, to coin a somewhat pointy-headed sort of term for it. The more interesting the ones for me and the ones that I've most enjoyed and cherished even when I'm at the World Bank across my time here was when we are dealing with issues where we are dealing across different paradigms. We're different in different epistemic communities, another fancy word to use. What does that really mean? We're dealing with people who have a very different definition of what counts as a question and what counts as an answer. And once you're dealing with that space, when anthropologists are arguing with economists, when scientists are dealing with faith healers, there's not a lot of space for common ground there. Not because they don't like each other, not because they're good people or bad people, because the modalities of engagement that they bring to each other are qualitatively different. So, it was mentioned before, back on the time I was in Vanuatu and a bunch of other countries that we worked in for many years, that was just rife with engagements across paradigmatic understandings. And I wish we would have more work being done in this particular space, because I think it's one of the reasons why we have so much conflict in the world. I think it's one of the reasons that America is in the situation it is right now, because we have two very polarized parties with fundamentally different understandings of what counts as a question and what counts as an answer. And when you're in that space, it's really, really hard to come back and find where the Venn diagram overlaps, because you're not even talking in a Venn diagram concept anymore. It's a whole different epistemology, a whole different way of engaging with that stuff. The work that our colleague Klaus Steininger and others have done looking at transitions in registration for land, to me, is another constant effort around the world to try and figure out how you engage with communities who have zero sense of what this fundamental economics concept called property rights actually means. Most Aboriginal people in Australia do not have any sense of that. Many nomadic communities have no vocabulary even around something like property rights, and yet they're told that that's really necessary for them to have a more prosperous kind of life. They've lived that way for thousands of years. They probably think they've done okay with not having this concept of property rights in their vocabulary. But once you start introducing modern methods of administration, once you require these kinds of spaces to be legible, to use Jim Scott's wonderful expression, we have to have tools at our disposal that are able to turn what for some other people is the home of their ancestors into something that counts as real estate so that we can buy and sell it, or that we can put GPS codes on it so that we can map it through satellite links. That's a really different way of thinking about what land is, what water is. So here's my different modality of recommendation for the summer. Watch a wonderful movie that all my students at the Kennedy School know because I've opened my class with it, Even the Rain, También la Alluvia. Even the Rain, set, some of you may have watched it. It's my favorite development movie because it's a movie about a documentary about a film. Wonderful magical realism. You don't know which door you're actually entering the room when you're watching any particular state of it. But it's all about trying to figure out how to use the expertise of Harvard professors to create a pricing mechanism for water. And Indigenous people are not haggling over whether it should be $1 or $2 a day. They're outraged that you can even think that rain from the heavens, from the gods, now has a price on it and we have to pay for it. So there's no arbitraging, we'll meet you halfway on all of this sort of stuff. It's a riot, right? It's creating this enormous conflict around what water actually is. The ontological status of this thing called water, so fundamental to our bodies, and yet such a source of deep discontent when we try to turn it into something that now needs to be managed, something that needs to be policyized in some particular way. How do we engage with those kind of questions? What does all the imperatives around climate change require us to do as we try and understand what's going on with atmospheres, with carbon emissions, and using languages and concepts that are, and words and vocabulary that are entirely alien to many people who are going to suffer the most from all of this. How do we do that kind of work? That requires very hard conversations, and I don't think we practice that enough. I don't think we know how to do that because we're all steeped in our own particular epistemic community and the people for whom we have a shared understanding of what counts as a question and what counts as an answer, and we deliver it accordingly. Until you find yourself in these really different places. One of the upsides, I guess, for me of being the only sociologist for 28 years amongst my wonderful economist colleagues is that I work in the office every day going, wow, I have a very different understanding of what counts as a question and what counts as an answer. And yet, here I am. I'm still trying to figure out how to make that work. And on a good day, we really have made that work. And I'm internally grateful and appreciative of this rare, literally once in a lifetime opportunity that was given to me to do that. So we have these different modalities now of looking at what creative destruction is. What I want to do is take you through a few different domains wherein there's zero dissent in the academic and the development community about the relationship we're talking about. But I want us to look at just how much, when you unpack the mechanisms driving these things, you just see forms of creative destruction everywhere, sometimes in very different forms across those different categories I've just given you. To do that, though, I want to open with, I think, one of the best quotes that I came across during my own research, and with a particular book I did with Biju Rao and with Simon Schroeder and with Chris Bailey in England, a wonderful chapter by Tim Harper, where he cites an Indonesian educator, Ki Hajar Dewantara, writing in 1935 about what development was doing to him. And I think for me, this is the 1935 version of what the Vanuatu chief was telling me. Slowly but surely, we have become alienated from our own people and our own environment. This alienation would have been bearable had it not been that in our case, the abandonment of our own culture did not, at the same time, bring access to another civilization. Thus, we have sacrificed what was ours, but we have not gained in its place anything that we might consider its equivalent. We have lost our world, but we have not entered another. We have added much new cultural material, the value of which cannot be discounted. However, it often fits so ill with our own style, or it's so far removed from it, that we can use it as best as decoration and not as material to build with. It is quite understandable why we have been so mistaken in our choices, because in the first place, we just have to choose, yet there has been so little to choose from. Wow. I love that. I think that's the most articulate statement, I think, of what my understanding of development is like for millions and potentially billions of people, maybe even every one of us in this room at some particular point. Since most of us are not born and raised in America, We had our own little moment of that, except we came from places of privilege for most of us, and it was that transition was pretty rough, and we're still figuring out how we've gone from being there to being here. But how do we do development in ways that smooths that kind of transition, or at least doesn't make it worse than it might have to be? And how do we do it in ways that doesn't just produce decoration, or what Lance and I and Matt Andrews in our related work called isomorphic mimicry? How do you just produce stuff that looks like it's actually real, but doesn't actually do the work you need it to do? And Dewantara was just lamenting that he just had lots of stuff that he could hang on his wall and make it look like he was in a modern home, but it wasn't in a modern home, and it wasn't an Indonesian modern home, more specifically, and that's what he really was seeking, and yet the items on the menu were not ones from which he could choose, and they've just ended up not being able to do the work that they wanted to do. These particular kinds of expressions, these kinds of laments, I think are one of the reasons why, since it's FCV week that we're in right now, we end up in situations where we have enormous amounts of intra-state conflict. Over time, a rising amount of it. That green space is not to do with not wars, it's not to do with extra state forms of conflict or internationalized work, it's all domestic. And I think that's one of the great paradoxes of working, or welcoming in some sense, countries into the middle income bracket, as it were, but recognizing that, geez, they don't want to stay there. And yet, as we used to inferred from the WDR recently on the middle income trap, lots of weird stuff happens in there, right? And unpacking that weirdness and why it leads to disproportionate amounts of discontent, I think requires us to engage more systematically with what are the mechanisms from a creative destruction point of view that elicit that kind of response. And I don't have the details and time yet to flesh all of that out, but I think that's been a long-standing claim in social theory, that there's when things start to get better, it's actually when things start to get much harder, because now you have a sense of what you can sort of achieve, but not fully achieve. There's still frustration because the systems you need to work don't, and you're still just left with this massive gap between what you hope for, what you expect, and what you actually live on a day-to-day basis. And when that wedge gets really wide, things start to fall apart. Indeed, that was one of the wonderful ideas that was conveyed in Achabe's famous book called Things Fall Apart. What was falling apart? The status of the elders, the means by which authority was being laid out in a town was just being stripped of people. And so when those forms of order, those forms of authority and legitimacy were stripped away, nothing was left except to watch things fall apart. So whether it's literary, whether it's film, whether it's in social science, whether it's in social theory, I think there's a lot of work that points us in this particular direction of trying to recognize just how freaking hard it is, and why it is an epic adventure and not just a smooth transition. It's always and everywhere, every rich country essentially has gone through some version of that, but we don't tell our history that way. We just want to celebrate the wonderful things that happen. Australia technically didn't go through its own form of that, but it kind of did. If you're an Aboriginal person, not kinda, all you experienced was a wholesale genocide of your people. There's nothing creative about it at all. All right? So in some way or another, every country, I think, has to have reckoned, or is still reckoning, or will in the future reckon with those kinds of challenges. And I think to why I'm such a proud employee of the World Bank is that on a good day, we do the work of acknowledging this kind of stuff. This is from a report a few years ago on exactly these questions of fragility, conflict, and violence. So just read the parts in bold. Over the past decade, there has been more deaths from political violence and homicides in middle-income countries than significant than low-income ones. Subnational conflicts occur even as countries see significant growth. National level growth can also mask deep institutional fragility. Well, that's the bank talking the right way, at least from my perspective. Yes, we want economic growth. Yes, we need it to fuel and fund all the things that we want to do. Geez, don't just think that's all it's going to do. It's to turn a low-income country into a middle-income country is really hard. And as I learned living in Malaysia for a year and a half, when that country desperately trying to show that it could graduate from middle-income country to high-income status and just couldn't quite get there, right? It's hard. And it's hard for the public sector, it's hard for the private sector, but at least for the purposes of the World Bank, trying to figure out how to do that work with the government really becomes a really key component to that. So that's one big sort of factoid, or sort of stylized fact, if you will. I won't go through each of these, but you don't need me to tell me your hope that as you get richer, you get more urbanized. As you get richer, you live longer. As you get richer, you finish more schooling. And as you get richer, your fertility levels and your family levels will start to go down. That's low-income countries merely over the last quarter century. If we were to do this over 250 years, that life, and smooth it all out, it'd be one direct horizontal line going straight down everywhere, except for urbanization, which would be going in the opposite direction. So that's how it looks for low incomes, it's how it looks for middle incomes, pretty much exactly the same. It's how it looks for high income countries. So no matter where you are in the world, that's pretty much the journey you are on empirically that is uncontestable, essentially, in any domain. What is interesting and what's less understood, I think, is what goes on between all of those things. From between that step of becoming richer and that step of having fewer kids, or between that step of moving from rural areas to urban areas, what does that actually look like? What does it entail for that to happen? And not just treat it as a graph on a piece of paper that's saying we get more urbanized. What does that mean? It means a huge number of people had to give up what they were doing and move, like my ancestors, from Cornwall, not halfway around the world maybe, but into the big city where they're going to try and do things. Historically, it's taken 70 farmers to feed every 100 people. That's what it was, flatlining for most of human history. How many farmers does it take now to feed 100 people? 3. That's 57. That's 67 farmers who suddenly had to, not suddenly, over long periods of time, having to reinvent themselves in terms of what they do and travel potentially long distances into urban areas and settling themselves up then in often in outskirts or in what we used to call slums because the cities just haven't been able to accommodate them, but that's the only option they've got left to them. Right? Again, but then we think back to, okay, well, so what do we do with these slum upgrading kind of programs? Well, that's a different kind of creative destruction moment that you have to have a very different kind of way of thinking about those kind of issues to engage with them. The last ones I just want to briefly mention are these issues around transitions and how we contract with one another, going from rules to laws, from deals to rules to laws, that those steps of engaging with handshake agreements to now having these written on pieces of paper. And for people that are illiterate, that is a massive, big transition you're asking people to go through. That they're now, their whole fate of their life depends on something they've put a thumbprint on when they don't even know how to read what they've just been saying. What it also does is create this great idiosyncrasy that turns a world of idiosyncrasy and fluidity, rather, to standards and categories. And we had a wonderful WDR that came out recently on those questions of standards, and they are obviously very central to producing scale and high quality products and services of all sorts of different kinds or another. But that by definition imposes a whole set of structures and strictures around the way that people function. So how the world is understood, assessed, measured, managed, and improved becomes very different when the modalities you use to do that work are now a very different form. You have a completely different way of understanding that. And again, this wonderful museum in Hobart that Connie and I went to several years ago was very explicit about recognizing exactly what that meant. That timekeeping was linked to observations of the sun, moon, and stars, and intimate knowledge of the land and landform, the seasons, the behavior of plants and animals, and other environmental phenomena, all now being required to be understood or reconciled with very different people's understandings of what counts as a question and what counts as an answer when you're engaging with those particular kinds of phenomena. So these are just a long laundry list of things I came up with for the mechanisms that connect or that get inflamed or that are potentially sources of great stress in the relational aspects of creative destruction, and that I think we need to, we as development people trying to be professional and fully immersed in the rich array of knowledge, not just single discipline knowledge, might come to. So rising agricultural productivity is the essence of why we end up needing so few farmers. So we need less of them. So that's one thing. And just to show this isn't a developing country phenomenon, there was an absolutely fabulous moving article in New York Times Magazine 3 weeks ago about a family in Pennsylvania who are dairy farmers who are a seventh generation family of running a dairy farm, and now having to sell it because they just cannot compete in the market they now find themselves in. Every thousand of all of those 1,000 cows were named by their children. They knew each of their cow on a personal basis. They've been doing it for 7 generations, so that it's baked into them what it means to be this kind of person. Poof, now that's all gone. Are they supposed to just retrain themselves and do something new now? Maybe, maybe they have to. Yeah, but it's just a wrenchingly difficult task. And you get weepy even reading something like that, saying, wow, is that just okay to see that happen? Or that's just what you sign up for when you engage in this kind of work? Or are there ways to protect that without stifling the need for innovations in long term? So the ethics of this are just really very vast, and yet I think we don't enable ourselves to understand them. So when you have people migrating, they can go to the cities, they can go overseas, they can go to all different sorts of places. Technology will enable all of that and to keep their communications going, which is great. But it also means you'll probably have fewer kids. It means you're going to have to ask your grandparents to do a lot more work. If you're going to be separated from your family for long periods of time, there's going to be a whole different set of challenges on raising the children, the fewer children that you have. All of those are going to probably go to school in some form or other. It might not be great, but they'll be going to a place that is calling a school. They will end up getting more education, we hope, as part of all of that. But then they could be back joining the queue with my Vanuatu village elder, worrying a lot about what's actually happening as a result of all this learning that's going on, and all the new medical treatments that they're being offered, which are potentially in conflict with the way in which they understand how they're supposed to be doing what they're doing. So I'm just going to, I'm beyond already my time. I'm having too much fun talking about this, but I want to recognize that there are conundrums associated with this. We need to always recognize just how hard it is. There isn't just a theory, a model, data we can call upon that will fix any of this stuff. I think we have to worry a lot about whether we try too hard to be inclusive sometimes. Right? There are very real limits oftentimes to the time periods we're granted to do things. And the whole abundance agenda and the critique of that is so much grounded in the fact that we're just meeting ourselves to death when we overload. So where is that fine line between being truly inclusive and hearing people who need to be heard, and yet recognizing that there are ticking clocks everywhere that really do require us to make hard decisions? Another paper I did recently was looking at this question of, are there universal red lines? Are there particular issues around which the bank has a mandate almost, if not a legal right to assert its own particular norms on certain forms of behavior? Are we okay with certain kinds of behavior that are in a more of a gray zone, right? Child marriage, child labor. Are we going to be outraged against all of that and therefore challenge people's culture and say, sorry, you don't get money because these are the norms that we uphold? Or do we recognize culture and say, this is your task to figure out, and we're just here to not engage in and violate the sovereignty of your own country? Where those lines are legally, we tried to show in a paper co-authored with Nyoki Na, really tried to show that the spaces between how those countries deal with international agencies and how they deal with their own indigenous people are often very out of sync with each other. And so there's a lot of working space in there that we need to fill out. And I think another particular area that I hinted at before was, once we're in this space where we're dealing with responses to these kinds of challenges that unfold along very non-linear, non-uniform trajectories, we need a much richer theory for interpreting that kind of data. Just having RCTs and claiming that's the gold standard, that's the methodology we use, that does not solve that particular problem. It does not help you to deal with impact trajectories that are big J-curves. Women's empowerment projects, democracy building projects, all pretty much have J-curves of one kind or another. You get pushback, you get violent pushback before maybe somehow, sometime, the curve turns and you get the outcome you want. But how deep is that curve exactly? What basis are you making those kinds of calls? So there's lots of ways in which this whole enterprise, once you think about it a lot, becomes much more than and a much more richer story than just trying to celebrate Kodak to iPhones. There's a whole rich way in which this messes with the highly prevailing way of doing things, by design, by definition, and yet oftentimes isn't really able to do that. I have some applications and implications for all of this. I will focus on, I'll choose the top three. I think, first of all, we as individuals in this room, we as employees of this organization, we who are development, or claim or call ourselves development professionals, need to recognize that we're not just in the creation business. Whether we like it or not, we are engaging with processes that can fundamentally alter, sometimes for the better, sometimes not, how people engage with the world. And if we just think of ourselves as the saviors, as the people who can provide good things to other people and that they're going to be grateful for all of that, I don't think that's incomplete. It's just not the fullness of what we're doing. It needs to be treated with a lot of empathy for those people that are actually going through this. To talk about just retraining people is something I think that tenured professors can say because they have tenure. They've never had it actually happen to them. If you've had to go through something wrenching like that, I think you should call upon that and recognize that it's even worse if you're doing it with zero forms of employment insurance and zero forms of health insurance and zero forms of training budgets to get you into a different place. You are left alone. That is what we need to be much more aware of. I think we also need to be much more of how we do what we do. In another study I've been working on for a while now, looking at how legitimacy is infused into really rough, intense, and conflict-centered engagements and works somehow. It doesn't work in a pill kind of sense or in a medical sense. It works because it's able to enable these difficult conversations to be had. And I think to do that well, we know that we need to have very different ways of thinking about it, what it means for government effectiveness. It's government effectiveness not just in having larger sums of money, not just in having bigger bureaucracies or fancier buildings or the latest technology. It's helping those, the mid-level and the frontline staff of those organizations to really do the work asked of them, which sometimes is relatively boring and administrative, and sometimes is really centered on the front line of engagement in health, in education, in social work, in youth advocacy, diplomacy. All those kinds of tasks are deeply relational. And if we don't have a modality for engaging with that kind of work and enhancing that component of other people's work, then I think we're just doing a lot of decoration providing. We're not giving people the tools that they own and operate, and that can help them do that much better. I'll finish with not the two best meetings of my career. I thought as a bureaucrat I had to sort of tell you about actually I will. I'll tell you about one of them. It was New Zealand, actually. It's hard for an Australian to give lots of praise to New Zealanders, but I'm going to, because in this particular case it's actually warranted. I was invited there to give a talk to them on PDIA, the problem-driven iterative adaptation, the approach to thinking about how we build state capability that Lance Pritchett, Matt Andrews, and Salima Samji and I have put together over the last 15 years or so. So I was invited to go to Wellington and to talk with the New Zealand aid group about what this was going to look like. As it happened, a week before I went there, the mass murder occurred that you may remember in Christchurch. 50 Muslims slaughtered in their mosque by an Australian, as it turns out. So I had almost this trip all planned out. And so I wondered, what's it going to be like when I show up? What was it like when a Saudi Arabian showed up in 9/11 a week after all of that? Am I going to be treated like that? I wagered with myself, no, probably not. But let's just see how this goes. I wonder how New Zealanders deal with the fact that 50 of their citizens who are mostly immigrants, who are mostly, or all Muslim, which is not the dominant religion of that country, how are they going to deal with all of this? So I went there I happened to be there on the 1 week anniversary of all of that. And what was that all about? It was nothing but solidarity. It was about engaging with people hurting and trying to figure out how to navigate their way through the most wrenching crisis that had ever taken for them. And they had an Islamic call to prayer, and at exactly the 1 week moment. And I looked around and said to people, is anybody gonna be worried that national television is showing an Islamic call to prayer? And they looked at me with this very perplexed look and said, why would we not want to do that? And then I looked around and noticed that about a third of the white women were all wearing hijabs to work that day. And I said, did anybody sort of campaign or to encourage you to send out emails to get you to wear one of those? And I said, why wouldn't we not wear one in this particular occasion. All the questions flipped. And I think that is in no small part, not just because of a particular cultural zeitgeist in some large sense, but because of a practiced, long-standing, century-and-a-half practice of learning how to have hard conversations with people in moments of grief, with Maori populations most especially, but something that, like any other deep skill in life, requires lots of practice, lots of patience, and lots of commitment to doing it well. And New Zealand doesn't blow up for those kinds of reasons. In those moments, they stand tall, not because they can triumphantly claim it to the world, don't beat themselves on the chest and show how awesome they are. They ask the opposite question of what everybody else asks and say, why do you not do that in those particular moments? And I think that is that's the kind of goal I want us to be able to set in terms of how we do things. That's crazy. That's never going to happen in my lifetime or my children's lifetime, but it's worthy of doing it. And I can't say that I've achieved success in doing so, but at least with the PDIA work, we have shown that you can, in fact, work with countries at scale. In the case of Cambodia, where I've worked for the last 5 years on this, over 1,000 of their senior, most senior staff, all engaging with these particular issues in a very different way. So in some sense, not just destroying, but overlaying their existing ways of doing things, with treating them as bureaucratic entrepreneurs, saying you can do this. You can actually think about a different way to move this forward. And when you create and protect the space for doing that, all sorts of new things suddenly become not only just more enjoyable to do, you give more agency and structure to what people are trying to do, but you actually start to achieve something that over time, hopefully, can work. Will it work? That's a different question. It can work with the right alignment of very contingent sets of circumstances. But that's what it takes to deal with these kinds of problems. They are riddled with these creative destruction moments, with these creative destruction spaces. And we, as researchers, we as practitioners should be able to engage with that much more systematically than we have. I hope that is what we continue to do. And I hope that we learn not how to be humble in those kind of moments, but how to contribute to those difficult conversations, because those are what get us out the other side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Susanna?
Wow, okay. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity to be here. It really is a privilege to be here today in many ways, but I don't know how many of you, a few of you know this here, but I was Michael's student in graduate school. And he greatly shaped my thinking and my experience as a professional. More than a professor, I think he exemplified a discipline that you could see. For those of you that have never seen him lecture or speak before, or the colleagues that are here, but every time he speaks about something, he has a discipline, both as a human being in the kind of principles and integrity he brings to bear on the topic, and at the same time, the academic and intellectual excellence and brilliance, which is really a rare combination to see, those two things at play. And really, I've always, don't judge me for this, but I've always wanted to be a philosopher. I almost went into philosophy, and Michael and the exposure to his intellectual acumen really brought my love for philosophy and my love for development together in a way that I had never anticipated or thought was possible before. It happened, luckily, in my early 30s, but it was really a novel experience for me. So you can imagine the type of emotion to be here today at the World Bank and be reflecting on his last lecture at the bank. Since then, since I've interacted with and was a student in graduate school, I really saw in my professional and development career the ways in which his frameworks and observations played out, both inside different organizations and across various levels within those organizations. And I found that the elements of creative destruction, if you will, but all the other topics he touched upon here, he's fully an interdisciplinary thinker. These elements were central to the challenges that I found as a development professional to get things done on the ground, about ways in which things worked at the front lines. He really gave me a conceptual lens to ascribe more nuance to whatever was happening in front of me, assess it in a more analytical way, break it down, and then strategically design plans to overcome a lot of the hurdles. And this happened as a civil servant. I was head of the statistics agency in Brazil. It was a 12,000 person organization across 600 agencies, 600 buildings. It's like a massive industrial data collection plan, which during the pandemic was almost forced to come to a halt, except that we went into the kind of modernization that Michael talked about, which really was a type of creative destruction at play. And there was much to reflect on, and I could readily apply all of that experience there hands-on. And later as a director at the IDB, there was a lot of transition and change during that moment as well in the organization. And now in this formidable challenge as vice president of Latin America, which is a region that's undergoing a lot of change as we speak. So what I learned from Michael helped me understand more fully the how of what we do, which was his last slide here. And be it in the government, in multilaterals, or in regional banks. So I want to turn to this. Michael's home at the World Bank has been the Knowledge Bank, right? The research group. And since Michael arrived in the organization, I think it has been richer for bringing this sociological approach inside the research group, precisely inside the research group, which comparatively to the other areas of the bank was the most homogeneous set of professionals within the bank. So it was disruptive in multiple ways. And it, throughout time, we can say that the bank has moved more and more to being a know-how bank, to being a bank that is not only focused on what works and on the instrument or solution at play or approach that is the technically correct one, but thinking more about that tacit knowledge about what makes that instrument, approach, product work in that particular context. And so under Michael's leadership, numerous studies and reports were able to track and organize. They mentioned the one in Cambodia, for example. Not only is the study engaging with the process itself, but at the same time, it is distilling and disseminating this information in real time. And it's reform at play, right? It's reform at play in this conceptual and strategic way, and helps us organize this tacit knowledge, which is extremely hard to grasp. It's extremely hard to even ascribe words to these relational challenges that we find in reform implementation. My PhD was about this, and Michael helped me greatly, as well as others who are in this room, like Lant Pritchett. But the know-how bank can be a true platform for, if you will, the modernization or creative destruction within the organization in a way that we can better serve our counterparts. It is this middle pathway that Michael described, and it can be a cornerstone of the logic and understanding of the details of when and how things work, and can be effective in the practice of development. The issue is that large bureaucracies, large and complex organizations such as this one, as well as the counterparts that we work with, are almost allergic to this type of approach. And the challenge is, how do you work in an environment that wants to get rid of you? Maybe that was why I said brutal to him. And the tension of trying to implement change in a place that is allergic or made to resist change is, and this is not just about, obviously, all large bureaucracies, I'm talking about large complex organizations, is what's at stake here. And at the heart of this challenge is the PDIA movement, and where Michael landed in the last slide, which is these organizations, they're trained to go to the solution and to arrive at the solution very quickly. And perhaps they're not incentivized to spend as much time on defining the problem, on thinking what exactly is that challenge that we're trying to solve for. And this creates a difficulty where usually you have the form driving the function as opposed to the other way around. And there are many challenges, and I look across the room and I see some heads nodding. There are many challenges to doing this in the organization. I can speak to a few just today. It takes time. It takes time to discuss the problem. It also takes time to build the trust and to have the frank discussions to actually arrive at the problem. It takes breaking silos, because the discussion that you're going to have just in infrastructure or health will be different than if you put the health and the infrastructure, education professionals all in the same room and have this interdisciplinary discussion. It also may not lead to the circumscribed projects or solutions that the organization expects in the time that it expects it. The incentives are not there to reward these types of approaches or thick processes of engagement. And last, not to rain more on the parade, there's tremendous risk, because it gets very, very messy. It can get very messy and uncomfortable to have the frank debates and to really hone in on what the challenges are. So what can we do about this, right? And I think those are the 6 implications that Michael talked about. And I find myself in a similar situation than when I was a student with him, which is these big picture discussions that are kind of shifting paradigms. And we're left to, okay, but how do I digest this and apply this in a practical way to affect change on a daily basis within my realm of possibility? And I just wanted to put 3 immediate reflections, some of which obviously Michael already spoke to, about how we could move forward. And one is to deliberately and intentionally create these spaces for debate and disagreement, purposely. We're actually in this room to disagree. And here is there's no development without the struggle. There really isn't. So it does have to get uncomfortable. It has to get tense. When the problem is hard to solve, and there are many that we're facing now, that we need to have the hard discussions with ourselves, with our counterparts. There's no other way forward if we really want to have the impact that we anticipate. And here, the features, it's a feature, it's not a bug. Disagreement is a virtue. So this mindset to accept then the relational changes that result from that disagreement. I think I want to just underscore this point, because I'm living this myself. when it gets uncomfortable and when it gets tense, that immediately affects relationships in a team and in a group. And it's very hard to manage. It is very hard to keep that esprit de corps, to keep everybody aligned, thinking about the impact, and really navigating the relational changes as a virtue, right, as Michael said. So doing that in practice really takes a different kind of EQ than we're trained as professionals. And that's something for us all to think about. I think the second point is once we have that problem identified and have this created the space for that disagreement and the trust to have that happen, how can we harness the bureaucracy? How can we harness all the demands that the bureaucracy has of us to solve the problems identified? And here I think it would be really interesting if we could spend more time on connecting the dots. Connecting the dots on the strategies, the implementation plans, on all the different kinds of initiatives that we have within the organization and then externally with the counterpart. To think about the political economy in that given region, in that given country, how that country relates to the border countries, to the broader region. To think about the connection, I hate this word, but it really, Michael will have a better word probably, but the quote-unquote connective tissue of that implementation strategy, right? And how we can embed iteration in these positive feedback loops to be able to, we're not going to get it right the first time, but then we have to go at it again, and we have to adjust, course correct, but then go at it again. But in the meantime, we have to keep everybody involved, and we have to take care of the relationship and relational dynamics. So I think here, connecting the dots speaks to this national development program. Not so much sectoral, yes, sectoral strategies, but always connecting those sectoral strategies to a broader national development plan. And third and last, motivation. I want to call it motivation because it's more than incentives. It's about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, about how to recognize and reward the staff that are really rolling their sleeves and getting things done, but oftentimes very quietly, because it's very hard to identify what is making something work on the ground because of this tacit knowledge. And usually these people are not the ones in the, that are having visibility. But shedding light on those champions, on those implementation champions, and be it the entrepreneurs that Michael was talking about, or other, it's not just it is a different kind of champion. It is the champion that is going at it day in and day out, and is resilient enough to try the same thing 40 times, iterate on it, and still stand to get it done. Those are the kinds of people we need to recognize and shed light onto, and make sure that they don't leave the organization or their respective governments. Shield against attrition at any cost. Protect them. They are Green Berets. And I just want to end saying that Michael has been a precursor to all of this thinking, to all of this nuanced understanding, and even the language that I'm speaking here today. You see, I borrowed it and extrapolated from his lecture, and I keep doing it because he never repeats. That's the other thing. He can tell the same story, but it'll be like completely different and interesting. So I have to say it's a fountain of knowledge and experience with this integrity, and at the same time, world view of development that is truly extraordinary. And you've built a legacy. You've built a legacy around the world. You've built a legacy at the bank. And it is our responsibility to take this legacy forward. Expand the application of your school of thought to enhance the ambition and scale of the practice of development. You started your talk today, and you said that many times you felt incomplete. Today, and I won't cry because women can't cry. Today, I'm joking for all the, but today, with this last lecture, I feel incomplete. And I put it upon ourselves, at least upon our teams, that as we say this farewell, it is a pledge to you that in our domain, we will find ways to make our engagement complete and to make development practice as impactful as it can be.
We've heard an incredible talk and an incredible tribute. I think both of you have laid bare the inadequacies of bank bureaucrats and transcended them brilliantly. I am unilaterally going to extend this meeting till 2:15 with Claudia's permission. And you're all welcome to stay because we have people here who will have things to say. And Viju.
Michael, that was a tremendous talk. And I want to drill down on something that Susanna said, which really struck me as very important. Many things she said struck me as important. This one, how do you work in an organization that wants to get rid of you, right? 20 years ago, you and I wrote a paper on the disciplinary monopoly in development research at the World Bank, because we were saying that the research department needs to open up to more sociologists and historians, political scientists. As you know, I'm leaving as well. And when I see where we are today as opposed to 20 years ago, the research department is not what it was for a variety of reasons. And our plea to poke at that discipline monopoly didn't succeed. And now you're leaving. So I want you to reflect on that a bit and ask how the bank can do differently as you're leaving, and you may have the freedom to say what you want to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there other questions? Please.
Michael, thank you for this. I was thinking when you were talking about creative destruction, Paul Graham wrote an essay called Hackers and Artists, and he drew the parallel that hackers and artists have a lot in common when people don't think that. And then you draw this parallel with development professionals, policymakers, we can be creative. My question to you, kind of a follow-up of the last one, is I'm really curious, during your long tenure at the bank, what has been the most creative destruction you've seen that the bank has done to itself? And maybe more topically, we're going through the whole knowledge bank merger between IFC, IBRD. I come from IFC. I'm also equally interested into hearing your thoughts on that potentially as a creative destruction.
Thank you. My name is Ram. I work on digital agriculture. Very thought-provoking presentation, which leads me to be a bit forward-looking. What needs to be done differently in some of our client/member countries, which have been destroyed physically and mentally today, and what is the new meaning we should give to the word reconstruction in IBRD? Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about how you think the World Bank takes a view on how much creative destruction there should be. I see this a lot in growth and jobs diagnostics, focus on static distortions, misallocation. The WDR from 2024 talks about challenging incumbents. How much do you think we're sort of over-indexing on destruction?
Thank you for these wonderful talks and the wonderful discussion too. My question, I remember once, Michael, you hearing you tell us how many people it took to discover the Higgs boson. And it was like an overwhelmingly number of people, because these big things, I mean, no one can do these things alone. So my question is, aside from like watching from each other and keeping each other accountable and like calling out on each other, sometimes we hope the bank can do things alone, or we look at the leadership of the bank as if they can fix it. And my question would be, what are the other stakeholders that are part of the authorizing environment, for example, that the bank operates in, or that are outside of the bank but can help the bank move in that direction?
Thank you. This is fascinating. As you were talking, I was thinking about the tension we have between the institutions that we're promoting and the institutions that we may be destroying. The example you gave actually about land is quite interesting. As an economist, I was trained to learn about the market failures, how we're going to improve markets. And when I started working for the World Bank on land issues, I realized that markets are incomplete. Not all the land is for sale. Water is not necessarily for sale. So we're trying, let's say, to formalize, land rights and create land markets. But this may actually put a tension on the other institutions that govern, land use, land allocation, that are non-market-driven institutions. So there's a bit of a tension here. And I know we have some safeguards in our projects to make sure that we do not do harm, that people are not being, relocated involuntarily, this type of thing. I was wondering whether we would need some safeguards in the bank, actually, to mitigate a little bit of the destruction. What's your take on that?
Hi. Michael, great lecture as always. And I'm going to indulge in remembering our times with the science of delivery, or as a friend, as a British friend used to like to refer to it, SOD. So that's, we discussed a lot about that. And at the time, we did some work that I don't think, unfortunately, went maybe what it should have been. But now that you can look backwards and being a howist, we are undergoing a lot of changes and a lot of streamlining, which is, change is not good or bad in itself. But in that world of streamlining and of measuring and of scorecard indicators, what is one thing you think in the how, on the implementation part of what we do, that we can do better to build those feedback loops and to iterate, but meaningfully iterate, and not just click buttons?
There are a couple of people on WebEx. I invite you to step in. If you're on WebEx and would like to ask a question.
Hi.
Yeah.
My name's Camille Nuama. I'm in the surreal position of watching demonstrations in La Paz and trying to listen to this at the same time with Susanna, but it was fascinating because, and then checking out the movie Even the Rain. And also, as somebody who's leaving, I think this thing resonates well, and I just want to add the comment. I just want to share a conversation I had the other day with the newest IFC staff in the field, just to give us a little bit of hope that, as Susanna said, if we find the spaces to have these different kinds of conversations about the work that we're doing, apart from the delivery objectives, the conversations about getting to sustainable, resilient results with the countries that we operate in, and we have those spaces where we don't have, where there's a little bit of no time constraint, because I'm also trying to write the disbursement ready action plan at the same time. That's my day. There is so much integrity in the young people that are working in the bank today, and I hear it from that I think that we have the chance to build all of this into where we're going in the future. And that's the only thing I'd like to say in this big reform that we're doing. I do think that the crystals of this are still with us as they've always been with us, but Susanna's right, we need to find the spaces to allow these conversations. I'm going to end the comment by saying, I'm talking to the newest IFC staff, who's like a crypto entrepreneur, and he said his PhD was going to be about the different ways that the indigenous and colonial people in Bolivia thought about money and trade. We have it. All we need to do in the bank is to create these spaces for these conversations, like today's, for these conversations to have. I'm really privileged to have sat here for the hour and a half while I'm watching the TV on the demonstrations and listen to this. I think that As I'm also leaving, but I have a lot of confidence that we're going to get there, and we're going to continue to be the leader in innovating this philosophical approach to development. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Camille. One more person on WebEx?
Yes, I have a question. Hello, Michael. Very lovely to see you after and a great lecture. Many thanks. I think my first question's been answered. I was going to ask how many people are being appointed to replace you in the group. It sounds like the depressing answer may even be 0, which I think would be a disaster. But my other question is whether you think the bank is set up at all to address the really big problem, which you did briefly mention, which is the environmental challenge that we're all facing and how that is an enormous challenge for development itself.
Thank you, Michael. I know you always talk about your career as being very unique to a certain moment in time, but just to pick up on our colleague online who was talking about the new generation of development practitioners, what kind of advice do you give to your students who are entering development at this point in time? And also maybe the advice do you give to new retirees who are also entering a new chapter in their own development profession?
Did you want to say something? Okay, look, I think I just want to quickly also pose a question to both of you. If I understand, one dimension of the prescription is greater humility, sensitivity, curiosity in design and implementation, trying to understand better the objects of development. The second is a more integrated view, not just the tunnel vision of economics, but political science, social science, so that we understand better both the individual, what constitutes development from their perspective, and also the political context. But let me first, Michael, you spoke brilliantly for a long time. Yeah. Now you'll speak brilliantly for a short time.
7 things, which I will not try and cover. Let me just sort of use it as partly reflected and then tap into the various different questions. I've always said to people, younger people who ask me for advice about joining the World Bank, choose your manager very carefully. If you get on well with your person to whom you report, that's 95% of your mental health. And I've been unbelievably blessed by a whole string of managers and directors who were all economists, who maybe didn't have a lot of time for my discipline per se, but had a lot of time for me and gave me the protection, the resourcing, and the freedom to do what I thought I wanted to do, what I came to the bank to do, what I thought was what I could do. That wasn't just bad economics, but good enough sociology. So if anyone else coming in the bank, interview your manager as much as they're interviewing you. If you have a great manager, I can name, which I won't, but of the people who I know who are just extraordinary managers who just did exactly what their job was to do, which is to protect all the people doing the real work in there, and as it becomes necessary to speak to other people. I remember a very early meeting I had where a vice president for LAC was talking to a bunch of junior researchers who were about to assess a flagship initiative for a mayor who was about to go to election. Huge incentives to be able to tell a happy story, to keep the mayor happy. And he looked every single one of those young people in the eye and just said, you do your job. You find whatever you need, whatever you think you find, you apply the best methods in the time and resourcing and envelope you have. It's my job to deal with whatever that particular outcome is and to convey it in ways that need to be conveyed. None of us in the research group who've been here for a long time will forget the way that Anna Ravenga gave her final speech when she left, essentially saying, I'm retiring to protect the World Bank research department from not being able to do its particular work, and got a standing ovation, and she rightly should. Because those were the kind of people who we had, who were strong enough as leaders to do the really, really hard work. Right from the beginning, I worked with people like Scott Guggenheim, Deepa Narayan, Martin Ravallion, a force of nature human beings, every one of them. But they were bureaucratic entrepreneurs that I didn't even know as a concept. They were able to create and protect the subspace for me and the kind of work that I was doing. And so my first mission trip to Indonesia was just so incredible because I got to see a whole manifestation of what a development project looked when it was designed by an anthropologist as opposed to an engineer or an accountant. And I cried. I just thought, wow, it's actually possible at scale with hundreds of thousands of people to incorporate social theory and design a whole intervention like that. So which is to say, extensions of what Susanna was saying, we just need lots of really good leadership that creates and protects space to let people do what they want to do. That's the golden rule. Treat other people like you want to be treated. That's how we run the PDIA stuff. We treat our colleagues in government departments as people who should be cared for and given the freedom to explore and do what they really care about. And to the extent the bank can hold that, then whatever the broader machinations are higher up the food chain, I never climbed that high, so I didn't have to worry about it. But I did what I did, and I want other people to think that the bank will be always like that, and that the task of management is to keep doing it. That's enough for now. Everybody needs to go.
One final word.
I feel it's inappropriate for me to have the last word, but so I think we're not the all of the above bank. In fact, quite the opposite. I think with the new jobs and growth agenda, we're going back to the basics and addressing the mission creep and focusing on the bread and butter of development. So, and I think this organization was my first job out of college 25 years ago. It has shaped me as a professional, and a big part of that is the degrees of freedom you have within these corridors to really pursue what matters. And I think Michael spoke to that, and I fully believe there is so much space in this organization to accomplish and fulfill the mission that he described and to carry this forward. I think both at the individual and also at the systemic level, it's all about building coalitions, it's all about PDIA and applying those principles day in and day out, and most importantly, being resilient.
Thank you very much. I should just clarify, when I said all of the above, I was referring to the sources of energy rather than anything else. But it was a brilliant conclusion and one of the best talks I've heard. And I'm grateful to our two brilliant speaker and discussant.
The little factoid I was saying there, like what the world record is for the most number of co-authors of an academic paper. It was the discovery of the Higgs boson, 5,245. Yeah, it's a 30-page.